this area, but she sent me a thing from StubHub about standing room only seats for last night's game. They were $1,100 for standing room only seats. And I told her, I said, you know, I would pay $1,100 and stand when the Trinity comes, but I'm not sure that there's anything else in my life that I would, you know, maybe do. Well, so we're on and running, and we're so glad that you're here. Those who are joining us live, and I know some people have called this morning and said you're going to be watching us live. This is the camera, Liz, right here at the back. And other people, I hope, will be watching later on today as we record this. This is going to be a 3-session Bible study, all of the lessons from the Old Testament, looking at the theme, God Keeps Promises. And we're going to be looking at those promises by studying 6 influential figures in the Old Testament. And Mike Abernathy already indicated that he knows that, you know, I don't preach on the Old Testament a lot. I'm a good Lutheran. I preach on the gospel primarily. Secondary would probably be the epistle lesson, and then the Old Testament lesson. But I do try to do the Old Testament into my sermons. I love the Old Testament. I think it really is some of the most interesting stories and some of the most fascinating characters, and we're going to see 2 of those really fascinating characters today. Let me just start by saying, or by asking, what has been your experience with the Bible? How have you related to the Bible over your years? What was maybe growing up? Was there a Bible that was important to your family? Did you see parents or grandparents or other relatives interacting with the Bible in a way that was memorable? Just a few folks who maybe have an experience with that.
When I was real young, 6, 7, Mom and Daddy had a really old Bible that had these beautiful pictures in it.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is David, so I look at David and the line and I used to just love looking at the beautiful color pictures.
Yes. Those were they really were almost works of art, and some of those old Bibles with those pictures. Yes. Yes.
My mom had a really small, white Bible that she kept by her bedside, and she read it every night.
Okay.
But I have it now, and she used it so much that the pages are very thin.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, and the text is so small. I don't know how she even read it.
I wonder, with being a white Bible, I wonder if it was one that she got when she was married.
It was small.
Yeah. Yeah. I had not thought about this in years, although I should have remembered this, but I'm almost positive that Anne, when she processed in, carried a Bible with her flowers. And I think she did that not because she was marrying someone in seminary, but I think she did that because she was a good Baptist girl, and that's what you did in Hamlet. You carried a Bible down the aisle when you got married. So, Mike?
You know, my grandmother and grandmother, I stayed with them so much, they read the Bible a lot, and I heard all these Bible stories, so let's just say I probably didn't do a lot of reading of it for a long time. And then a couple of years ago, me and you had lots of discussions about this. I read the whole thing. And
Cover to cover.
cover to cover. And I said, boy, this ain't what they taught you in Sunday school.
No.
When you get to the Old Testament,
Yes.
I mean, it's rough.
It's brutal. I hope maybe to do this. There's a really good 1-year Bible study of the Old Testament that I have taught before, and I would really like to do that. But inevitably, you know, you'd have a class of folks who had never read those parts of the Old Testament and were just astounded at some of the things that are in there.
Everybody tends to read the same verse.
You do,
70 years old, you hear the same verses repeated,
yes.
but you never get into the, go 2 verses down or 2 verses before and the murder and the mayhem and everything.
Yeah, and you try, this course does a good, the course that I was talking about does a good job of, I don't want to say justifying those awful things, but explaining why they were done. One of the perfect examples is, after the Exodus, when the Jews are taking over the promised land. I mean, that wasn't an empty land. There were people living there who had lived there for centuries. And, they understood that God said, you clean it out. And cleaning it out meant you clean it out of men, women, and children, horses, oxen, whatever's there, you clean it out. And it's pretty awful stuff. The reason, of course, that they did that was because, we're going to talk about today the family, that Hebrew family. If you go intermarrying with other people, intermingling with other people, it's not so much a purity of race as it is a purity of religion. That's, you start marrying Canaanite people, Canaanite women who have Canaanite gods, and they start bringing their gods into your home, and it dilutes who you are as a Jew. That's not justification for it, but that's explanation for it. And, I had passed along a sermon that a United Methodist minister in, is it Mississippi or Alabama, somewhere, Arkansas, somewhere down there, had preached, and he said, everybody wants to say, is this biblical? And he said, well, there are a lot of things that are biblical that are not good and noble. There's some pretty horrible things in the Bible. And, just because something is biblical doesn't mean that it's to be emulated. You all know this, that in the days before the Civil War, some of the best defenses of slavery came from the Bible. They were preached from southern pulpits, including Lutheran pulpits, not 1,000 miles from here. You can get copies of those sermons that are just ringing endorsements of slavery. Here these people were living in deepest, darkest Africa. They were going to die in their sins. And because of slavery, we have them here with enlightened people like us, and we're able to teach them the gospel. And, they come to our services on Sunday. If you go to the Old Oregon Lutheran Church, there's a balcony up there. Well, that wasn't a balcony where they put the teenagers. That was the balcony where they put the slaves. And they worshiped, together. And if you go to St. John's Lutheran over in Mount Pleasant, there's a separate section where slaves of the families that belong there are buried. So just because, it's from the Bible doesn't mean that it's wonderful. These stories that we're going to be looking at in this are wonderful stories. The Bible that I remember the most is my father's Bible, which I have. I was looking this morning at it. He got it in 1949, which would have been about the time he moved back to North Carolina. And this is the American Standard Version. That was replaced by the Revised Standard Version, which I think is what we've got still in here. I think that's the Revised Standard Version. Now there's a new Revised Standard Version, and we're fixing to get a new Revised Standard Version. What this does is just to be cognizant of the changes in language. Language changes, and the example that I like to use is that statement in the New Testament where Jesus says, "Suffer the little children and let them come to me." Well, suffer in the King James Version meant something very different from what suffer means now. Suffer meant allow or let. Let the little children come to me. Allow the little children come to me. Well, we wouldn't use that word suffer in that context today. Language changes. So the Bible is more than 1,000 pages long. It's very daunting to start it and read it through. Covers 2,000 years of history, almost overwhelming. But the great thing about the Bible, and someone described it to me as a rosebud that is opening. The great thing about the Bible is the more you get into it and the more you explore it and the more it opens up before you, the better it gets. You know, the more you read the Bible, the better it gets. There are a lot of things like that. I remember when Lutheran churches began to go to more frequent communion. Many of you who were raised Lutheran remember that. You know, it used to be typical for, way back in the day, Lutherans to commune maybe 4 times a year. Christmas Eve and Easter being 2 of them. Ash Wednesday, probably. And then it went to monthly, which I was here during that time when it was monthly, and there was some pushback to that. You know, people said it's, you know, the old thing, it's not going to be special if you do it more frequently. And they were looking at it as if it was, you know, chocolate ice cream. Chocolate ice cream is a wonderful treat, but if you eat chocolate ice cream every day, maybe it's not that special to get it. And I think that I heard an illustration which I was not going to use around people like Peggy Wilkinson and Miss Gribble. So I softened it by saying, no, you should think of it instead as hugging your spouse or hugging your child. You don't say, I'm not going to hug my daughter but 4 times a year, because that way it will be really special. You hug your daughter every chance you get, because the more you do it, the better it is. And it's a great experience. It doesn't wear out. And you know, I kind of lost my track there. Why was I telling that story? I guess about the, you know, reading the Bible. It's an important thing to do, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are really, they may not be the oldest parts of the Bible that were written down, but the first 11 chapters of Genesis are the oldest stories that are told in the Bible. I mean, they are what we refer to as prehistory, almost so old that, you know, for generations they were told around campfires and things like that. 5 major stories in Genesis 1 through 11. They're all familiar to us. The creation story, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of Noah and the flood, and the story of the Tower of Babel. And each of those is broad, a broad story. It tells a story that answers questions for humanity, for everybody. Questions like, not so much how was creation done, but who is behind creation? You know, God is behind creation. Why did God create? God created out of love. God created because He wanted there to be something and someone. You know, this God is loving enough and caring enough that He wants company. He wants to be surrounded by creatures and by beings. How long has there been evil in the world? How long has there been sin in the world? Well, almost since the very beginning. You know, the story of Adam and Eve. You got everything you could possibly want in this garden. I mean, you have no needs at all. everything is perfect and blissful. You got one rule. There's fruit on this one tree that's forbidden. And you know, the joke is, Eve said, well, I understand, just out of curiosity, where is it, the tree? You know, where is the tree? Or Adam said it. Whoever wanted, both of them said it probably. Cain and Abel. The fall. How long has there been evil in the world? Well, since the very beginning. How long have brothers fought each other? How long has there been jealousy? From the very beginning. And so, you know, when we wring our hands these days and say, oh gosh, you know, as my friend Delmer says, you know, when his grandmother and his great aunt would get together and play Ain't It Awful, you know, they'd be rocking on the front porch and just talking about something, and one would say, ain't it awful? It's just awful, isn't it? It's just awful. And, you know, we could have been playing, I mean, what period would you want to go back to that was good? You know, and I think I've said in here before, we had a woman in Albemarle who she watched a lot of evangelists on TV, and she was convinced, I mean, absolutely convinced, every time they said the end of the world is coming, she knew this was it, you know. And we were talking one time after she had been disappointed that Jesus had not come, and I said, well, you know, why do you think Jesus is ready to come now? And she said, because it's so awful, Pastor John. The world is so awful. And I said, well, tell me a time when you would like to go back to, when things were good. And she immediately said something like 1954. She said everything was good in 1954. And our custodian was over there, David, was over there working, trimming the shrubs. And I said, let me ask you something. I said, you think David wants to go back to 1954? And she said, maybe. I said, really? I said, he couldn't go into a restaurant, couldn't go into a movie theater, watched his children go to substandard schools, couldn't go to the library, couldn't go to an amusement park. So you think David looks at 1954 as this a perfect time? And she admitted, probably, there's no time that was without pain and strife and struggle. And these 5 stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis try to explain that. We're not talking about the historical. There are some people who say, you know, these stories are literally true. They literally happened just the way they were written. If that's your opinion, that is fine. I understand that. There are other people who say they are stories. They are just stories. I don't like that phrase, just stories, because stories are powerful. They are stories to explain how this happened. If that's your opinion, that's fine. Neither of those are my opinion. My opinion about these stories is that these are true stories. And the emphasis is on the fact that they are true. They are stories about my life and your life. How we know the right thing to do and don't do it. How we become estranged from the people who are closest to us. How we receive redemption and forgiveness and an opportunity to start over. You know, it's like Jesus telling the parable of the prodigal son. Now, did Jesus know a man who had 2 sons? Maybe. Or was Jesus telling the story to illustrate something? Maybe. But if you focus on those 2 things, are you missing the point of the story? Absolutely. The point of the story is that it's true. That's the way God deals with us. We are rebellious. We wander away from home. We have no right to go back home, but when we do, God welcomes us. And that's not only a true story, but that's an astounding story. And so, you know, with these 5 stories from the Old Testament, we can get caught up in things, you know, well, in that whole creation thing, where were the dinosaurs? Well, the Bible doesn't even pretend to tell us where the dinosaurs were. You know, and if you're looking at the story of Adam and Eve or creation to find out where the dinosaurs were, you've missed the point. Well, is it possible that the ark would have survived for 4,000 years? And because we have a group of biblical scientists who say they found it, does that mean it's true? Maybe. If that's what you want to base your belief in this story on, that they found some remains of a wooden ship somewhere in Turkey, that's fine. You've missed the point of the story. That even though God was angry and justifiably angry with creation, He made a provision for us to survive. And that's the truth of the story. In chapter 12, though, everything changes. Chapter 1 through chapter 11, prehistory. In chapter 12, everything changes because we meet a man. And through that man, we have a promise that is specific to a family. And this covenant, this promise to this family is going to be the rest of the Bible, essentially. We are going to follow this family through ups and downs and twists and turns and intermarriage and great figures of the faith and great disappointments. And it's all interwoven. But it is a family and it is a promise. So this promise really means to solve the problem that the first 5 stories told. The first 5 stories were told to illustrate the fact that God gives us everything that we need to be joyful and to be happy and to be fulfilled, and inevitably we mess it up. Now, how are we going to solve it? Well, we can't solve it, so God solves it. And how does He propose to solve it? Through a people. Through people that we interact with. So let's turn to Genesis 12, verses 1 through 5. And this person's name at this point in the story, the very beginning of the story, is Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Okay, so if you're going to be a people, if you're going to be a nation, you got to have land. There's no, this is not social media, you know. It's not a virtual community. I had an interesting meeting the other day. This is an aside. I had an interesting meeting about churches and attendance and things like that. We have done better than the average church in America about coming back from the pandemic. Apparently nationwide, churches are about 60% of what they were before the pandemic as far as attendance. We're better than that. Last Sunday was not good, but you know, we had people playing golf and going to ball games, and it's, you know, kind of the last gasp of the fall before it starts getting cold and everything. But it was interesting. We were talking about, you know, why people had not come back. And one of the pastors said, well, you know, when all of this happened and all the churches started doing what we did, buying new equipment, one of the things that we really talked a lot about was that this is okay. Even though we can't come to church, there is a virtual community that will exist that we can all plug into and be a part of by watching on Sunday mornings. It's a community. Believe me, it's a community. So don't worry about the fact that you can't come to church. You got a community, and then some churches said, well, you know, we're going to draw the line at communion, and then some pastors like me were dumb enough to say, well, I don't really care what the bishop says because we need to have communion. We had people saying, I miss communion. So what we did was we said, okay, you can have bread and wine. I understand some people had other items. I think scotch was mentioned a lot, you know, whether or not Jesus accepted that. But it was a community. And the guy said, now, the pastor said, now, what we're trying to say is, okay, it really wasn't that real a community. The real community is back here. So don't sit on the couch in your bathrobe with your cup of coffee watching church and thinking that you got community. You really need to be here and be present. And he said, we've confused our people and we're talking out of both sides of our mouth. That's true. We were so desperate to have a community together. And, you know, many of you have served on church councils, and you know the way church councils think. Church councils are not big on saying, okay, we just spent $18,000 on cameras, microphones, and everything, but we're not going to use them anymore because we want you back here at church. That is not the way church councils think. What do you mean? We spent $18,000 on new cameras and we're not going to use them anymore. That's what? We should have just used Liz's phone for for those 2 years. Yeah, that was a pretty bad thing. But you got to have land if you're going to have a country. All right. So go to the land I will show you, verse 2, chapter 12, verse 2. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. Here's a key. So that you will be a blessing. Now that's a big statement. What is it about Abram that makes him worthy to be chosen for this? Not a thing. There is nothing special about him. He's a wandering herdsman. Nothing. Why'd God choose him? Because God is God. Abraham Heschel, who was a great rabbi, used to say, how odd of God to choose the Jews. Of all the people, and this is not an anti-Semitic statement, because you could have said it about any of us, but, the Jews are described in the Bible as a stiff-necked people, difficult people. And yet these are the ones that God chooses, and God says, you will be blessed, not just because you're my people, you'll be blessed for a purpose, and that purpose is to be a blessing to others. And as you follow the family down the line, you find that sometimes they do this in marvelous ways. They are a blessing to others, culminating in the birth of Jesus. It is God enfleshed, born of Jewish parents, born in the city of David, in Bethlehem, just as Jewish as you can get. And sometimes this family fails miserably in being a blessing to others, and sometimes God pokes them and prods them and shows them that even though they are God's chosen people, they are not the only ones who are God's people. And, you know, Jesus did that a lot. And when he told this parable of the Good Samaritan, and Samaritans were hated. They were hated so much because they had been Jewish. They had been in the family, and they intermarried and intermingled and lost the truth. They're like oh God, my cousin just came in. You know, your cousin from Schenectady. He said, let's try and get him here and get him out of town as quick as we can before he embarrasses us. You know, it's that sort of an understanding between Jews and Samaritans. But you are blessed so that you can be a blessing. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Everybody's going to be blessed through the Jews. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So he's never seen this new land. He's no spring chicken, you know. Oh, I'm 23. I can go anywhere and build a life. 75. And he's sent to this new land that he's never seen before. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. Okay? So that's the promise, and that's the family. If there's anything that commends Abram, is that he trusted God. He said yes. And you know, for Luther, that was the remarkable thing about Abraham. It was also the remarkable thing about Mary, was that they both said yes. When they were under no compulsion to say yes, it was a call. Well, you know, you can turn down a call. You can say no.
Before Abraham, were Jews Jews, or were they just wanderers? Is he the beginning of
I think he is considered sort of the father of the family. I think there were people who were in this region of the world and in this time who were known as, I think the term was Habiru, which basically meant people who wandered around, who didn't have a city to settle in, who raised sheep and did those kind of things. And so there are people who think that these Habiru people were the ones who eventually ended up becoming the Hebrews. But Abram is the one that really starts it.
So when you say the whole Bible is about one family,
That one family.
so that means, if that, and the whole Bible is about the Jews, so that means he was Jew one.
He was number one. And really, you know, Muslims consider him the father of their faith and of their group. They trace it through a different line of the family. But, you know, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, that's one thing that we all embrace and keep in common, is that Abraham is called Father Abraham for a reason. He's, you know, the one that you look back to. He trusts God. He's a model of faith. Think about the people in the New Testament and the Old Testament who said yes. You know, David, Peter, Paul. I should have not done this order, but it's Peter, Paul, and Mary, right? I mean, Mary. We were talking about the incarnation at confirmation class, and I remembered this little girl in my confirmation thing when we were talking about the Annunciation, you know, when the angel Gabriel shows up. And I had just told the kids, you know, these are 6th and 7th graders, that Mary would have been about their age. And one little girl was just shocked. She was like, oh my gosh, She was like 12 or 13, and I said, yeah, I mean, that would have been typical when a young woman would have gotten engaged in that day. I said, most of them are not living long lives, you got to go ahead and have your babies. Then this little boy who was behind her said, oh, gosh, I see on Wikipedia they think Joseph was 35. I have some real problems with that. And I said, you're missing. Yeah, let's not go there. That's the wrong part of the story. But I was telling him I remembered being in confirmation class and having told him that, Mary would have been about their age, and the angel Gabriel comes and says, are you going to do it? And Mary says, let's go for it. This is what we're going to do. And the little girl said, not me. No, I'm not doing that. Not at 12 or 13, absolutely not. And I said, why not? She said, I have to face my daddy and tell him, oh, I'm pregnant, but it's the Holy Spirit that's done it. I have to, my neighbors, my grandmother. I mean, you think about all those things that Mary faced. I mean, it was a scandalous thing. Joseph, even when he found out she was pregnant, considered divorcing her quietly, right? When he could have publicly humiliated her for it. But Mary said yes. Abram said yes. I'm not 75 yet, but I know how at almost 64, if somebody said, you got to move to Poughkeepsie. Really? Got to get rid of all this stuff? It's cold in Poughkeepsie. I've never lived, in a place like upstate New York. It's a very different thing, but he says yes. And that for Luther was one of the marks of a person of faith, is that you say yes when God calls you. Not always understanding. We also know that Abram was very human. I had a professor at Duke who used to say that he loved for people to say, oh, if we could just be like the people in the Bible. And he would say, my God, we are just like the people in the Bible, because when you read these biblical stories, they all are just average human beings that God uses in great ways. I mean, think about it. Moses, a murderer. Paul, a persecutor of the church. Peter, absolutely just impetuous. Doesn't think about anything he says, doesn't think about anything that he does. Rahab the harlot. The person who basically saves the Jews as they're conquering Jericho. I mean, she runs a brothel. That's what she does. My New Testament professor, Mickey Eford, used to say, that one of the funny things about the Bible is, the Hebrews send spies into Jericho to sort of scope out the place. They'd presumably never been to Jericho. Where do they end up? At the brothel. Well, if they hadn't been there before, somebody gave them information about where to go really quickly. But the madam of the brothel becomes the one that protects them and saves them. And then amazingly, when you look in Matthew's gospel at the genealogy of Jesus, there she is. So Jesus' great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmama owned a brothel, which is pretty amazing. That, first of all, amazing that God would work it through people like that, and secondly, that the Bible would admit it. That's another thing that's true about the Bible. If there's something in there that's embarrassing, it's probably true. Because if there'd been any way You know, I mean, people talk about the virgin birth. They have a problem with the virgin birth. Look, it was scandalous in the Bible. And it would have been easy to just leave that part out. But the Bible doesn't do it. Which says to me, they had to put it in there because it was known. You know? So Abram is a character. Let's just look very quickly real quickly at chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. There's a famine, and Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt for refuge, for safety. Matthew's gospel, which is the most Jewish of the gospels, when the Holy Family goes to Egypt to escape Herod, Matthew wants that to be what we say, oh gosh, that's just like Abram did. Abram went to Egypt to find refuge, just like the Holy Family. So it's not incidental that this happens. So Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt. Verse 10, there was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. So say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. What a lousy thing to do. What an awful spouse. I'm hear Ann Futterer if I suggested that to her. My God, you're the father of a great nation that's going to be a blessing to others? When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. So, you know, if you got an attractive wife, make her available, and good things will come your way. What a terrible role model. What a terrible example. But it's biblical. Yeah, but don't you go out there and behave that way. So I think the thing that's so good is that it shows the humanity of these biblical characters. I mean, they are just like us. I remember when all these things come out about people who are heroes. And you realize that they weren't perfect. I mean, we can think about that. I mean, we know now that John F. Kennedy, for whatever you want to say about Camelot and all of that, we know that apparently he was a terrible womanizer. FDR, probably much the same. Abraham Lincoln, much more concerned with preserving the Union rather than freeing the slaves. He was going to do whatever it took to preserve the Union. When it was expeditious to free the slaves, when that was going to help the cause, he immediately did that. But that wasn't his primary goal. Probably the latest one maybe was Mother Teresa. That someone wrote a book about her and said, that she was prone to just enormous waves of depression. Well, my gosh, she has a ministry dealing with the poorest people who are all dying. You know, how could somebody be cheerful and upbeat? To me, this just shows their humanity. I was talking about my father in about 1953. Dwight Eisenhower, who was president at the time, 53, 54, came to Pinehurst for a press conference. I'm quite sure that President Eisenhower came to Pinehurst to play golf. You know, that's why he was there. But he decided to have a dinner and a press conference. And my father, this is the story that my mother would tell. My father was so excited. Dad, you know, we had a radio station. Dad never did the on-air stuff. He was always behind the scenes. He was selling advertising. He was, you know, making sure that everybody was paid. But by gosh, General Eisenhower. You know, my father had been in World War II. He was going to be there to see General Eisenhower. And my mother said he came home from the luncheon, you know, and she said, well, how was it? And he said, my God, he was an old man. He was an old, bald man. And she said, well, you know, I don't know how old he would have been, probably in his 50s, maybe. You know, but my father would have been, you know, 28, 29, 30, thought he was just an old man. And he said he was eating his salad. And he said he dropped a blob of Roquefort dressing. That dates it right there when you call it Roquefort dressing. He dropped a blob of Roquefort dressing on his tie. And my mother said, yes. And he said, we took his finger, scooped it up off his tie and ate it. Scooped a piece of blue cheese up and ate it. And then he took his napkin and dipped it in his water glass. And he said, it was General Eisenhower that did that. And he said, I thought, God, he's just like me. That's what I would do. I would scrape the Roquefort, you know, the piece of blue cheese up and eat it. So these people are just human, like we are human beings. When they reach Canaan, they've got a land and they've got a name, they've got a nation. They're a people. Now, chapter 15 is where it gets beautiful and earthy. It's chapter 15, verse 5. God brought Abram outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And again, he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. It's almost as if God said, yeah, you really screwed up big time down in Egypt, but because you believe, because you have faith, I'm going to consider you righteous. And this covenant is going to be with you. Then he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But Abram said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought all these, and he cut them in two, laying each half against the other. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. And then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and there shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. This was what was called as cutting a covenant. You cut the animals in half, and you put one half on one side and one half on the other. And you and the person that you were making the covenant with would walk between those animals, and you were essentially saying, if you break this covenant, this is what you're going to end up like. Cut in half. So, the first one down the middle is a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, all of these heights. So you understand why for modern day Jews living in Israel, this is such a big deal. This is our land that God promised to our father Abraham. And they feel very possessive of it. Now, of course, on the other side, you have Palestinians who have also lived there for thousands of years, right? Descendants of the people that the Jews subdued when they moved back into the land after the Exodus. Palestinian, if it sounds sort of like Philistine, the Philistines were one of the early groups that were there that they had to get rid of. So this hatred, this desire for the land has been going on for a long, long time. Abraham chapter 17 verse 5, God says to Abram, no longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the ancestor of a multitude of nations. Name is very important. Knowing your name and who you represent by that name. Remember, that's why they used to call baptisms christenings, right? Watch that old movie, Father of the Bride, the old one with Spencer Tracy and Elizabeth Taylor. They don't know the name of the kid until the baby is baptized. He's christened, he's given a Christian name. So that name is important, and families used to keep the name quiet until the christening. It was a big deal. When Moses goes to the burning bush and has this conversation with God, and God says, you got to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. What's the first thing Moses wants to know? What's your name? Because I got to go and talk to Pharaoh, and he's going to say, who sent you? And I'm not going to say some burning bush. I need to know who you are. And that's when God says, I am who I am, which is translated Yahweh. So that name is important. So Abram becomes Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah, because they are new people. They are different people. They have children. A great story. When God, they get older. They're 99. Still no babies. And, God says, I promised you, you're going to have descendants. You're going to have a kid. And that marvelous place where Sarah laughs when she hears it again from God. That's what I would do if I was 99. You're going to have a baby. Yeah, right. And God said, I heard you laugh. And Sarah says, oh, no, I didn't. And God said, don't tell me that you didn't laugh. I'm God. I know everything. I heard you laugh. So then when Isaac is born, they say, God says, you're going to name him Isaac. What does Isaac mean? You laughed. So every time she called him in for supper, she had to remember that she laughed at God. You know, when God said, you're going to have a baby. God loves to remind us of our foibles. One of the signs of the covenant, I feel like we're going into a biology lesson here. One of the signs of the covenant is of course, circumcision, right? I used to think, well, that was sort of a bizarre sign of the covenant, you know. Maybe it would have been better like if you just did a little tattoo on your arm or, you know, pierced your ear or something. Oh, he's one of us. He's got his ears pierced. It was where it was because it was about descendants. It was about having babies. And they knew how you had babies. So every time you were going to have a baby, you remembered. You remembered that there was a promise, there was a covenant, and you were part of that. And you know, it's an amazing thing, really. Last thing, to look at my, about to leave here. This is not a conditional covenant. In other words, God never says to Abraham, if you are faithful, then I will do these things. It is absolutely an unconditional covenant. The blessings, the relationship, the land, the promise, everything is unconditional. Doesn't matter if you mess it up. I'm going to continue to be faithful. Doesn't matter if you squander the opportunity. I'm going to continue to be faithful. And when you read the Old Testament, it's really, especially like, the book of Judges, it's all it is Israel messed up and they were in a bad way and the future looked bleak, and God sends somebody to bail them out, to show God's faithfulness, and the person bails them out because God was with them, and Israel is restored, and everything is wonderful, and then Israel does the same thing again. Back to being unfaithful. And the whole cycle repeats again and again and again. And you think at some point God would have just said, because Moses does, right? Moses deals with them in the desert. After the Exodus, it's like, well, being a slave in Egypt was bad, but at least we had something to eat. And Moses is ready just to wash his hands of these people, his people. But God keeps saying, no, I know they're this way. Lord, I've been dealing with them longer than you have. And don't you think God must say that about us? A lot. Jesus, I know. I know how they are. I give them minds to do great things. What do they invent? We invent the biggest bomb ever. Just kill everybody really quickly and really efficiently. Whole nations wiped out. it must be a tough job to be God. That's for sure. These descendants of Abraham become a family. They become a new people. They are the Hebrews. They are the Jews. This ties into what we believe about us as Christians, right? We are not saved because we are worthy people or because we are righteous people or because we're good people. We have potential. None of that is the reason that we are saved. We are saved because God loves us. Why is that so? I don't know. But it's true. And so, we become heirs to that promise that God made to Abraham. We become a part of that. We are spiritually adopted in baptism. We have a new birth. I've told you before, I don't think I grew up much different than most males. I didn't know anything about a lot of things with women. Just never asked those questions. I'd always heard about water breaking. Well, your water broke. I've been there and Ian's in labor and the water breaks. And I was like, Jesus Christ, that's a lot of water. I mean, it just gushes. It gushes. And I was like, I never knew it was that. Well, that's why we use water. You're born wet the first time, and you're reborn wet the second time. And I remember in worship class, the discussion about when David Keck was in seminary, they were taught when you baptize, you just touched them. And the emphasis was that the water is so powerful, What's that stuff that you used to say, a little dab will do you? Broker? Yeah, a little dab do you, don't do that. Well, when I came through seminary, they said, no, you want to splash it around a little bit because, it's a second birth, so you got to get them wet. Now, my gosh, I've been to baptisms, these young pastors think, well, they're going to drown this kid, just all over. And I was at a baptism, and the pastor who was baptizing took both hands, scooped up water, and poured it on them. And my cousin, who is Episcopalian, when they baptized his kid, the kid was naked. The little baby was naked, and they dunked him under the water, into the water. And I think it had a little flushing device. You'd hit a button and all the water, because you know what happens when you put a baby in water. You'd hate to be kid number 7. Yeah. So you hit a button and all the water goes, and then it fills back up before the next baptism. Episcopalians are so technological and so innovative. But we become a part of that, right? So let me ask a few questions here. First of all, why is it hard for us to accept unconditional promises? When we say that God's love for Abraham was unconditional, God's love for us in baptism is unconditional, why do we immediately say, okay, it is unconditional, but you have to do this? Why is it hard for us to just accept something as being unconditional? It's too good to be true.
I mean, we're a suspicious society. I'm a suspicious person. I'm trusting that.
That's right. And if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, right? Yeah.
It's just human nature.
Right.
We've also been disappointed.
Sure.
Yes. been disappointed by offers that were too good to be true, and they were too good to be true. Also, a little bit about, and maybe Americans are more, that work ethic that we were all raised with. You got to earn it. There's nothing special about you. You don't deserve it. You have to prove it. You have to work. That's the way I was raised. One of the proudest moments of my life was when Ann Carlin did LVC and Lutheran Volunteer Corps, and her director said to me, she's not like a lot of people in her generation. She works, and she doesn't expect that something is going to be given to her. She earns it. She works. Well, that was a proud moment that you can hear. That's right. That's right. Because, you always hear stories about, well, this generation, they just don't want to work. I'm sure that our parents said the same thing about us, and my father's parents said the same thing about him. I think I've told you before that my grandfather, when Dad started listening to Glenn Miller, he's like, God, loud damn music, all those damn trombones and horns and stuff like that. It was Glenn Miller, He was like, oh, well, listen to that loud stuff. And I'm sure my brother got that when he was listening to the Beatles and the Temptations. What are you going to listen to that for? But we forget that it's undeserved. We don't earn it. It's a gift, and that's a great thing. The best things in life are undeserved, right? Children, grandchildren. You look back on your life and the spouse, friends. We've all worked hard to get what we got, but we also know that there were things that happened, people who looked out for us, people who helped us, people who gave us advice, not because we earned it, just because of who they were, right? Some of us think about the sacrifices our parents and grandparents made for us. There are no self-made men or women. It's all a gift. And that's what we realize in these stories. It's also, we feel more comfortable with it being in our control rather than God's control. Isn't that ridiculous? I got a lot more confidence in God than I do myself. If it was up to me, that was Luther said, don't leave it up to me because I'll screw it up. I know I will. I'll mess it up. I want God to be in control of this because God's going to do it right. Is there ever a time in your life when God's promise to you seemed absurd, but it was fulfilled? Can you think of a time when you thought, well, I feel like this is what I ought to do. This is kind of what I feel like God is telling me to do, but gosh, this seems so unreasonable. And then it happened? I'll go first. I was standing right where Mike Abernathy is. 6 years ago, we had the retired pastors of North Carolina here. And we're meeting here, and we were having devotions in here. And a pastor that I have known all my life as a pastor looked at me and said, why the hell did you take this call? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, you're $1 million in debt in Kannapolis. You're never going to get out. Ever. I felt this call. Ann felt this call. We met with the council. Matt Fisher went up to Ann and hugged her. And she said, oh my, that's so nice. Who are you? And he said, Miss Fuller, I'm Matt Fisher. And she said, well, Matt, you were 7 the last time I saw you, so forgive me for not. And we walk out of that room, and Ann said to me, this is where we're supposed to be. And I said, got to work with Liz Fisher. She was a 4th grader when I was here. I don't know how that's going to work.
That was just like 10 years ago.
That's right. So it's worked out so well. That was God's promise, and it was a promise that maybe seemed a little absurd to think that we were going to get out of $1 million of debt. But we did. And we did it together, and it was a wonderful thing. Anytime in your life.
Preacher said that you standing right over there. Talk to him later.
Yes.
Okay.
I made a point. I made a point of writing him when we had the service, and not in a bad way, because he's actually related to one of our members, and he's a good, sweet man, and I think he was probably well-meaning in a bizarro way, you know. If he was really well-meaning, he would have called me before I took the call and said, what are you doing? But, you know, he was like, yeah. But it was a good letter. Anybody else? Maybe in your life, maybe there's been a business venture or, you know, I don't know, buying a home, building a home, moving to a new community, taking a new job. You just thought, well, is this going to work? And it did. And then the last thing before we leave, you know, we talk about Abraham as being our faith ancestor. Who are some other faith ancestors that you've had in your life? Examples of the faith, people who taught you to trust, people who taught you to believe. Who are those folks in your life? You gonna name all the Louders, all those Louders.
Yeah. Well, I have my family, of course.
Yes.
We're always very devout. But I had my youth counselor growing up stands out to me. His name was, he was Louder. He was a distant cousin, but he walked the walk. I mean, we met at his house every Sunday night.
Right.
And the whole group of us still very connected to him.
Yeah.
Because he was like, he just mentored us
Yep.
through our teenage years, and it stuck. He's always stands out as being a person of faith, but I always trusted.
That's one of the biggest blessings of doing what we do. Liz has so many people that she's connected with from other churches, you know, and I do too. And you realize that you made an impression on them, and obviously he made an impression on you. Anyone else? We could, you know, Fred Rogers, in his talks used to say, I want everybody to take 60 seconds, and he'd say, I'll time you. And I want you to think about all the people who made it possible, get emotional thinking about it, who made it possible for you to be where you are. People who would have rejoiced, are rejoicing that you've accomplished the things that you've accomplished, that you've got the life that you've got. And he could get away with it because he was Fred Rogers, you know. And so, oh,
Such an example of faith for me and for the people of this church, because you walk the walk.
well, you're very kind. Thank you. And I,
Being new to the church, an attorney brother is terminally ill with cancer. I was torn beyond belief. Back, Peggy put her arms around me, Lindsay, I had tears in my eyes, and I felt the spirit like, it was amazing.
yeah.
Then, I'm Catholic. This is my home, this is my church now. But I do go to Mass at St. James every once in beautiful video. It came to you. I was blessed. You sat down with me. You did the same.
Yeah.
Joseph went from 280 pounds still to 90.
Wow.
Every time the phone would ring, thinking he's passed away.
Yeah.
How long ago was that? Do you remember?
3-4 years? How long?
He's alive and well.
Really?
He's alive and
Unbelievable.
it's the only thing I can say is it was a miracle. All three priests made a commitment to me. They had a picture of him on their kitchen table, record. When we're together, we both pray for Joseph. And through that time period, each one of them will say, "How's your friend doing?"
How about that?
I said, "Oh, well."
Just amazing.
He's retired. He loves going to the gambling casino. He's driving. I mean, it's the only I can only say it's God's gift. It's God's
Yeah.
will and prayer and support.
Well, it is, and it's so good to hear stories like that where you say, well, I know somebody, I know a story, and it makes you realize also how important it is what we do here on Sunday morning, the support and the love. And I agree with my friend. When we were online only, it was a community. It was a community out of necessity. But there is nothing like being together, face to face. That's really the most important thing. And I appreciate you sharing that. We all have people who have been ancestors in the faith for us, who have been examples or whatever. I would say that for me, one of the greatest examples is my wife. Very strong faith, and she's probably the strongest Lutheran that I know. And I think her mom, bless her soul, always thought that if anything ever happened to me, Ann would go back to the Baptist church. But she's a stronger Lutheran than I'll ever be. And I remember we were doing First Communion instruction, and it was when the church randomly decided to move it to third grade. And Ann came to the meeting. She had no business being there, except to refute what the church was doing. And she said, "This is just wrong," which is not what you want your wife to say during a first. She said, "This is just wrong." She said, "We are Lutherans and we believe that you're saved by grace. So what is it, that God's grace doesn't begin to come to you until you're in the third grade?" She said, "We baptize babies. We should be communing people as soon as they're able. If they're a part of the family needs to eat." Yes. And I was like, "Don't you have somewhere to be, Ann?" Like in choir practice going on, because it was hard enough for me to get third graders, parents to get third graders to commune. But yes, spouses, pastors, teachers, all folks, can be really, and to be aware of the fact that we have a responsibility maybe to be an ancestor in the faith for somebody you don't know who, you might be influencing in a good and positive way. So thank you for being, any questions or anything like that? I'm sorry I go too far. I would ask you to keep in your prayers Debbie Troutman. Debbie had high hopes that she was going to avoid more surgery, and when the doctor came in Monday, it was obvious that so they had to remove the hardware and put new hardware in. It was a less big operation than it had been several months back, but she was hoping, that she was going to get out Monday afternoon or Tuesday. It's going to be at least Friday. They don't leave you in the hospital now for a week unless you're sick, And she was just delighted. I saw her Sunday, and she said, "I want you to look at the nurse when you go out." She said she's 89. And I said, yes. She said, she's 89. I said, how is that possible? And she said, well, she's sharp as a tack, and she can do what she does. And she said, and I said, I've never heard of that in my life. And she wears the old-fashioned hat. Yes. No, yes, at Mercy. So, I thought that was really something. I don't know. She's got a good retirement, I bet. Yeah. All right, thank you so much for being here. I hope to see you next week. Thank you, Liz. Well, you know, it's hard.